There's a rule I picked up a long time ago about reading military conflict claims, and it's this: the loudest version of a story is almost never the most accurate one. And nowhere has that been more true recently than in the reporting around Kurdish fighters in Iran. You've probably seen the headline, "Thousands of Kurdish fighters just did something to Iran." That phrasing has been floating around for weeks now, and before we get into what's actually confirmed, I want to tell you plainly, the real story is both less dramatic than that headline suggests, and in some ways more serious, because what's actually happening involves real documented deaths, real named victims, and a genuine risk of a new front opening in a war that's already reshaped the entire region. So let's slow down and go through this properly, sourced, verified, no exaggeration in either direction, because the people whose names appear in this story deserve better than being reduced to a number in a thumbnail, and you deserve better than a headline dressed up as a finished analysis. Everything in this video is built from named, cross-checked reporting, conflict monitoring organizations that track individual incidents in real time, Kurdish human rights groups that publish the names of the dead, and multiple news outlets independently confirming the same events from different angles. Where sources disagree on a detail, I'll tell you they disagree. Where something is unconfirmed, I'll flag it as unconfirmed. That's the standard I hold every video on this channel, too, and it matters especially here, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets flattened into propaganda by people on every side of it if you're not careful about the sourcing. Let's start with the war this is all sitting inside of, because you can't understand the Kurdish angle without it. On February the 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iran that, in its opening hours, killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with several senior commanders. That's not a minor detail. That's arguably the single most consequential strike of the entire war, removing the man who had run the country since 1989 in a single morning, and giving that opening wave an extra layer of shock value on top of everything else happening across roughly 24 provinces that same morning. The succession itself is worth a moment of its own detail, because it shapes how the whole state has been operating since. Iran didn't collapse. A successor process installed a new supreme leader, reportedly from within Khamenei's own family line, and Iranian security forces have since held public memorials marking the 40th day since his death, standard in Shia mourning tradition under portraits of the new leadership. That continuity matters for understanding the Kurdish situation specifically, because it means the security apparatus targeting Kurdish camps and running ambush operations along the western border isn't some improvised, leaderless response to chaos at the top. It's an institution that reorganized quickly and kept functioning with largely the same operational playbook it had before, just under new nominal leadership. If anything, a newly installed leadership facing questions about its own legitimacy may have extra incentive to project strength against any perceived internal threat, Kurdish unrest very much included, rather than showing any hint of weakness in its first months in power. The state kept functioning, but that kind of shock to the top of a governing structure creates exactly the conditions where minority populations with long-standing grievances start asking themselves whether this is the moment to act, and Iran's Kurdish population, concentrated along the western border with Iraq, is one of the largest and most organized of those populations. The Kurds are the largest stateless ethnic group on earth, spread across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and inside Iran specifically, they make up somewhere around 10 to 12% of the population. Concentrated in the western provinces, Kurdish nationalists call Rojhelat, or Eastern Kurdistan. There's real history here. Kurdish groups declared a short-lived republic in 1946, and armed movements seeking greater autonomy from Tehran have come and gone for decades since. During the 1980s war between Iran and Iraq, both governments actually armed cross-border Kurdish insurgencies against each other, specifically to destabilize their opponent. A detail that matters because it shows this exact dynamic. Outside powers using Kurdish factions as leverage in a bigger regional fight is not new. It's a pattern with real precedent going back generations. It's worth spending a moment on that Iran-Iraq war precedent specifically because the parallel is closer than people realize. Throughout the 1980s, Baghdad funneled weapons and safe haven to Iranian Kurdish rebels specifically to bleed Tehran's military resources along its western flank, while Iran did the mirror image, backing Iraqi Kurdish factions to destabilize Saddam Hussein's government from the north. Neither government cared much about Kurdish self-determination as a genuine cause. Both were using an already armed, already organized population as a pressure valve against their rival. That history is exactly why so many Kurdish political figures today remain deeply skeptical of any outside power's sudden interest in their cause, because the region has seen this exact script before. A foreign government floats support during a moment of conflict. Kurdish fighters take on real risk, and then the outside backers' priorities shift the moment its own war ends, leaving the Kurdish side to absorb whatever retaliation follows, largely on their own. Today, the main organized groups are the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, known as PDKI, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, known as PJAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK, which has organizational ties to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, operating against Turkey, and two smaller groups, Kabat and the Kamala Party, which itself has several splinter factions, the kind of internal fragmentation that's actually common across Kurdish political movements in Iran, and has historically made it even harder for any single organization to speak for the population as a whole. Kamala alone has split into multiple competing branches over the decades, each with its own leadership and at times its own separate armed wing, which means even when people talk about the Kamala Party as though it's one organization, the reality on the ground is closer to a family of related but independently operating factions. PJK's connection to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, better known by its Kurdish initials PKK, is worth understanding on its own because it shapes a lot of PJK's current behavior. The PKK has waged its own decades-long insurgency against the Turkish state, and in recent years has been moving through an actual peace and disarmament process with Ankara. PJAK effectively operates as that movement's Iranian branch, sharing ideology, some organizational structure, and, in the past, fighters and resources. Analysts who track the group closely have noted that PJAK has explicitly said it will not disarm or dissolve the way the PKK has been negotiating to do in Turkey, positioning itself instead for a more active political and armed role specifically inside Iranian Kurdistan going forward. Some of PJAK's own leadership has suggested that Iran's increasing drone pressure against them stems partly from Tehran's own fear that a demilitarized PKK next door in Turkey could free up resources and momentum for PJAK to intensify its own operations along the Iran-Iraq border independently. That's a genuinely useful piece of context, because it means at least part of what's driving Iran's targeting decisions right now may have less to do with this specific war against the US and Israel, and more to do with a completely separate, longer-running calculation about the PKK's trajectory in a neighboring country. These groups have clashed with each other at points over the decades, which has historically undermined any real unified front. But in January of this year, during a wave of nationwide protests inside Iran, 5 of these parties came together and formed a coalition called the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan, with the stated goal of eventually toppling the government in Tehran and achieving self-determination for Iranian Kurdistan. So when the war started in late February, there was an obvious question hanging over the whole region. Would these Kurdish factions, sitting right on Iran's most vulnerable border with a coalition freshly formed, actually join in? And here's where you have to be careful, because a New York Times report from May of this year claimed that some Kurdish groups were actually expected to begin attacks and advance inside Iran as part of the original Israeli-American war plan, and that Trump personally changed his mind at the last moment and didn't approve it. The Kurdish groups themselves have denied receiving any weapons from the US or Israel, so what you have on record is a credible report that arming and unleashing Kurdish forces was seriously considered at the highest level and then pulled back, alongside firm denials from the Kurdish side that any such support materialized. Both of those things can be true at once. A plan can be discussed and then abandoned, and I want to flag that distinction clearly because a lot of the loudest coverage treats the plan itself as proof that a Kurdish offensive happened, and the actual record doesn't support that. What is very well documented, regardless of what did or didn't happen with US and Israeli backing, is that Iran didn't wait around to find out what the Kurds would do. Starting almost immediately after the war began, Iranian forces launched a sustained campaign of drone and missile strikes against Kurdish opposition camps inside Iraqi Kurdistan, hitting bases linked to PDKI, PAK, and other groups. According to the American Kurdish Committee, the campaign has now amounted to more than 850 separate attacks since February, leaving at least 6 civilians dead in addition to Kurdish fighters. Think about that number for a second. 850 strikes against a population that, going into this war, hadn't actually launched a coordinated offensive against Iran at all. That's Iran treating the mere existence of organized Kurdish opposition sitting across the border in a different country as a threat serious enough to warrant a sustained bombing campaign, independent of whether that opposition had done anything yet. Now let's walk through the actual clashes inside Iran itself, because this is where the specific incidents behind the headline live. The dates and locations matter for understanding whether this is coordinated or not. The first real confrontation happened on June the 7th in the Maravan border area of Kurdistan province, when Iranian forces used artillery and mortar fire against PJAK positions. After a brief lull, hostilities picked back up in late June near the town of Baneh, where PJAK's armed wing attacked a checkpoint on the Baneh-Saqqez road after a series of IRGC drone strikes, killing 2 Iranian security personnel. Checkpoints like that one aren't just symbolic targets. They're the physical mechanism Iranian security forces use to control movement in and out of Kurdish towns. Screening vehicles, checking identification, and in many cases, serving as the first point of contact between ordinary Kurdish civilians and the state's security apparatus on a daily basis. An attack on a checkpoint carries a different meaning locally than an attack somewhere more remote. It's a direct strike against the visible face of state control in a place where people actually live their everyday lives, which is part of why incidents like the Bane attack tend to escalate local tensions faster than clashes happening out in more isolated mountain terrain. On the evening of June the 28th, a separate PJAK unit called the Eastern Kurdistan Units came under heavy IRGC artillery fire in an area called the Gagosh Heights, between the towns of Mahabad and Piranshar, triggering hours of intense fighting that killed 4 of their fighters, 2 men and 2 women, according to a statement the group put out on June the 30th. Iran, for its part, said 5 of its own IRGC personnel were killed in fighting on June the 29th and 30th. Then came July the 1st, the incident that's actually driving most of the recent headlines. IRGC forces from a unit called the Hamze Sayed al-Shohada headquarters ambushed a vehicle carrying 6 PDKI fighters near the village of Kezkapan in Piranshar, killing all 6. Kurdish human rights monitors have published their names: Mohammed Kaki, Twana Osmani, Abdullah Mohammed Pour, Karo Hormozyari, Fardin Changizi, and Mohammed Amin Bayazidi, who, according to local sources, was the vehicle's driver and a member of PDKI's underground network in that specific area. That phrase, underground network, is worth pausing on because it tells you something about how PDKI actually operates inside Iran versus how it's often portrayed. This wasn't a uniformed unit crossing an open border in a column of vehicles. It was a small group moving quietly inside Iranian territory as part of a clandestine cell structure. The kind of operation built around secrecy and small numbers, specifically because open, large-scale movement would be suicidal against a state security apparatus with drones, informants, and fixed checkpoints. Losing 6 members of a cell like that in a single ambush is a serious operational blow to a group working this way, not because of the raw number, but because underground networks depend heavily on trust, local knowledge, and established movement routes that take years to build and can't simply be replaced by recruiting new fighters overnight. Iran's own account of this incident claims 5 Kurdish militants died rather than 6, a discrepancy worth noting because it's a small but real example of how even the basic body count in these clashes doesn't fully align between Iranian state sources and Kurdish human rights monitors. The IRGC didn't stop at that ambush. Within the following 48 hours, on July the 1st and 2nd, Iranian forces hit a Kurdistan Freedom Party camp near Erbil in Iraq's Kurdistan region with 2 ballistic missiles and 2 drones. Local residents posted video showing massive fires at the site. Within that same window, the IRGC also struck camps belonging to at least 2 other Iranian dissident Kurdish parties inside Iraqi territory, meaning within a single 2-day period, Iran carried out a lethal ambush inside its own borders and a multi-target missile and drone campaign against opposition camps in a completely separate country. Conflict analysts have pointed out that this kind of near-simultaneous timing across 2 different countries suggests real operational coordination on the Iranian side, even if the various Kurdish responses to it have been far more scattered. And that scattering matters, because it directly undercuts the thousands of fighters acting as one narrative. According to the Aklidi Conflict Monitoring Project, which tracks individual armed incidents across the Middle East in granular detail, PJAK was largely absent from a lot of this specific fighting, likely because its forces are less concentrated in exposed camps, and instead operate embedded in mountainous terrain, caves, and tunnel networks along the Kandil border region, which makes them a much harder target for drone and missile strikes than camp-based groups. ACLED's analysts also noted that targeting PJAK specifically carries greater escalation risk for Iran because the group has a stronger track record of retaliating directly inside Iran than the other Iraq-based factions. In its own public statement on all of this, PJAK said explicitly that it had maintained what it called a third line throughout the entire U.S.-Israeli-Iran war, meaning it deliberately avoided siding with either side and didn't attack Iran even while the state was at its most vulnerable in the opening weeks of the conflict. Their position is that the clashes happening now are a direct response to Iran intensifying operations against Kurdish forces and civilians after that vulnerable period passed, not the launch of some long-planned offensive. I think that statement from PJAK is actually one of the more important pieces of this entire story because it's a direct, on-the-record contradiction of the thousands of fighters just did this framing. Here you have one of the most capable, battle-tested Kurdish factions in the region explicitly saying, in public, that it chose restraint during the exact window when a coordinated offensive would have been most damaging to Iran, and that what's happening now is reactive, not offensive. That doesn't mean nothing significant is happening. 6 people ambushed and killed on a road, 4 fighters killed in an artillery barrage, a coalition of 5 parties formally organized for the first time in the group's history. These are all real and serious. but it's a fundamentally different shape of story than a Kurdish army launching an invasion. I want to bring in one more voice here because I think it captures the actual texture of this moment better than either extreme framing does. Majid Glai, who leads the American Kurdish Committee, told Fox News Digital directly that the latest clashes shouldn't be read as a full-scale uprising, but also shouldn't be dismissed as routine border violence either. His exact words, what I'm hearing is, this is not business as usual. He went on to say, these aren't periodic clashes on the border, these are operations, and they seem to be going in deep. That's about as precise a rate as you're going to get from someone actually plugged into Kurdish political circles, real escalation, genuinely different in character from the sporadic clashes this border has seen for years, but not yet the coordinated mass uprising the clickbait headlines are selling. There's also a wrinkle worth mentioning about who actually makes up Iran's broader Kurdish population, because it complicates any narrative of total unity even further. It's worth noting that some Kurds across Iran actually serve within Iran's own government security forces. Many other minority groups inside Iran, along with Persian opposition movements, have also historically kept their distance from Kurdish nationalist causes. That means even in a moment where 5 Kurdish opposition parties have formally allied for the first time, you're still talking about a fractured landscape, not a unified ethnic bloc acting with one voice, and that fracture is exactly why analysts describe what's happening as several separate, loosely connected escalations rather than one coordinated campaign. Let's talk about geography for a second, because it actually tells you something about coordination, or the lack of it, that raw casualty numbers don't. Mahabad, a primarily Kurdish city of around 170,000 people in West Azerbaijan province, sits roughly 230 kilometers north of Yerevan, where this specific round of clashes first started back on June the 7th. Pave is about 100 kilometers south of Yerevan. Bane sits roughly between Yerevan and Mahabad. These are not tightly clustered locations you'd expect from a single coordinated military campaign. They're spread across a wide arc of mountainous western Iran, each incident triggered by its own local flashpoint, an artillery exchange here, a checkpoint attack there, a drone strike somewhere else, rather than converging on a single strategic objective the way an actual offensive would. So what's Iran's own framing of all this? Iranian state media and IRGC statements have consistently used language describing these incidents as terrorist and cowardly acts, and framed their own operations as counterterrorism work against infiltrating teams. Iran's intelligence ministry has separately claimed it's working with what it calls noble Kurds to thwart what it describes as an Israeli-American plan to destabilize the country, explicitly framing the unrest as externally engineered, rather than a genuine domestic grievance. That framing is worth holding up against the PJAK statement I mentioned earlier, because you've essentially got Tehran publicly insisting this is a foreign plot, while one of the actual groups involved is on record saying it deliberately avoided joining any foreign-backed offensive during the exact window such a plot would have made the most sense to execute. Now, why does any of this actually matter beyond the human tragedy of it, which on its own is more than enough reason to cover it carefully? It matters strategically, because Iran just came out of, and arguably is still inside, a war that killed its own supreme leader and degraded significant parts of its military and nuclear infrastructure. Every resource Tehran has to spend running an 850 strike campaign against Kurdish camps in a neighboring country, plus deploying dedicated ambush units inside its own western provinces, is a resource not available somewhere else, at a moment when Iran is simultaneously trying to manage negotiations with Washington and fighting to keep the Strait of Hormuz functioning under its own terms. Think about the map for a second, too, because the Western Kurdish border region isn't some remote afterthought inside Iran's broader strategic picture. It sits directly adjacent to Iraq, a country where Iran has spent decades building political and militia influence, and any sustained instability along that specific border risks complicating Tehran's relationships with allied factions inside Iraq itself, not just with the Kurdistan regional government hosting these opposition camps. It's also simply a very long border to secure, running through genuinely difficult mountainous terrain, which is exactly why Kurdish insurgent movements have been able to operate there in some form for the better part of a century without ever being fully eliminated by any Iranian government, regardless of how aggressive the crackdown. A weakened center dealing with pressure on multiple fronts at once is exactly the kind of environment where a border region with genuine decades-old grievances becomes more combustible, whether or not anyone is deliberately orchestrating it from outside. There's also a really uncomfortable irony sitting underneath all of this that I think deserves to be said plainly. The reporting that the US and Israel discussed, then explicitly declined, arming Kurdish factions for an offensive appears to have been used by Tehran as justification for cracking down harder on Kurdish communities anyway, treating the mere possibility of foreign support as proof of an active plot, regardless of whether any weapons or coordination ever actually materialized. If that's an accurate read of Iran's own logic, It means the public discussion of a plan that was ultimately never approved may have made ordinary life more dangerous for Kurdish civilians inside Iran regardless, which is exactly the kind of unintended consequence that gets completely lost when a story gets compressed into a triumphant-sounding headline about thousands of fighters striking back. So let's actually answer the question the title poses. Did thousands of Kurdish fighters just do something to Iran? There is truth buried in it. Kurdish opposition coalitions collectively do claim fighting forces numbering in the thousands across several organizations, and there absolutely has been a real, escalating multi-province campaign of violence with dozens of confirmed deaths since February, according to monitoring groups tracking this closely. That part isn't invented, but the framing of a single coordinated strike by a unified Kurdish army is not what the sourcing actually supports. What you have instead is a fragmented set of local flashpoints, an artillery exchange in Merevin, a checkpoint attack near Banea, an artillery barrage at Gagash Heights, an ambush near Piranshar, playing out independently across a wide stretch of mountainous terrain, layered on top of an Iranian bombing campaign against opposition camps in a different country entirely, all happening while at least one major faction, PJAK, has gone on the record saying it deliberately held back from anything resembling a coordinated offensive. If you want to actually track where this goes next, instead of just reacting to whichever headline is loudest that week, here's what I'd watch. Watch whether PJAK's stated third-line posture actually shifts, since that group is widely considered the most capable and battle-hardened of these factions, and any change in their restraint would be the clearest signal this is moving from reactive clashes towards something more deliberately coordinated. Watch whether Iran's camp strike campaign inside Iraq expands to directly target PJAK's positions along the Kandil border, despite the higher retaliation risk analysts have flagged, because that would tell you Tehran has decided the risk of leaving PJAK alone now outweighs the risk of provoking it. Watch whether the coalition of political forces of Iranian Kurdistan, formed back in January, ever issues a single unified statement or claims joint responsibility for anything, because 5 parties agreeing to work together on paper is very different from those same parties actually operating under one command in practice, and so far, the evidence points toward the latter still not existing. And watch the casualty reporting itself, because even now, Iranian state sources and Kurdish human rights monitors are publishing different numbers for the same incidents, and tracking whether that gap widens or narrows over time will tell you a lot about how reliable either side's public statements really are as this continues. A couple more things worth adding to that watch list. Keep an eye on whether Iraq's own federal government, sitting between Iran's demands and its own Kurdistan regional government's autonomy, faces new pressure to restrict these opposition camps entirely, because a diplomatic squeeze from Baghdad could end up doing more to shape this conflict's trajectory than any single strike either side carries out. And keep an eye on whether any of these Kurdish factions start receiving overt, acknowledged support from an outside government rather than the discussed then declined support the New York Times reported on back in May, because that's the single clearest line between what's happening now, a genuinely organic, if uneven, regional flashpoint, and what the loudest headlines keep implying is already underway, an externally engineered offensive. So far, every group involved has publicly denied that line has been crossed, and the reporting hasn't produced confirmed evidence that it has either. There's one more layer worth mentioning before we wrap up, and it's the near total silence from most Western governments on this specific threat of the war. Compare the volume of official statements coming out of Washington, London, or Brussels about the Strait of Hormuz, about strikes on Iranian power infrastructure, about the naval blockade, against the near absence of formal government statements addressing the Kurdish clashes specifically. Kurdish advocacy groups in Washington have said openly that they feel left out of the diplomatic conversation entirely, that whatever framework eventually resolves the broader US-Iran war is being built around nuclear capability and missile programs, not around what happens to Kurdish communities once the cameras move on to the next headline. That silence isn't necessarily evidence of bad faith. It's entirely possible governments are simply prioritizing the pieces of this war with the most immediate global economic stakes, oil, shipping, nuclear capability, over a regional ethnic conflict with a much longer, slower burn. But if you're trying to understand why this particular thread of the war keeps getting compressed into clickbait headlines rather than sustained, careful coverage, that relative silence from official channels is a big part of the answer. It leaves a vacuum that gets filled by whoever shouts the loudest instead of whoever reports the most carefully. I know a lot of channels are going to keep running with the biggest, boldest version of this headline because that's simply what performs. My goal with this one, like every video I make on this war, is to give you something that actually holds up if you go check the primary sources yourself, the human rights monitors who publish victims' actual names, the conflict trackers logging individual incidents by date and location, the on-the-record statements from the groups involved rather than just second-hand characterizations of them. If that kind of grounded approach is something you want more of, subscribe, because this Kurdish front is genuinely one of the more underreported threads inside this entire war, and I plan on tracking it as closely as everything happening in the Gulf. And leave a comment telling me what you want covered next, whether that's a deeper dive into PJAK specifically and its history with Turkey and the PKK, the broader history of Kurdish statelessness across 4 different countries, or how Iran's post-Khamenei leadership is actually managing a war on this many fronts at once. I read every comment, and it genuinely shapes what gets made next. If you're new to this channel and this is your first video on the broader conflict, there's a fuller back catalog covering how the war started, what happened in the Gulf, and how the Strait of Hormuz standoff has evolved. And watching that alongside this one will give you a much more complete picture than any single video on its own ever could. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.